So as Jimmy said, I'm Leor, I'm Chief Marketing Officer of Augusta. Very briefly, Augusta is the largest litigation funder in the UK. We support law firms and their clients with funding for cases. That's all I'm going to say on Augusta. And as Jimmy said, I've spent 20 years in marketing, originally as a journalist, so then went to business school. And then for the last 16 years, I've been in Marcoms roles. Back to what Jimmy said, my first director role was at Deloitte for one of the 4 service lines, and then Ernst & Young, where I spent 4 years running marketing comms for one of the service lines across Europe. Then to FTI, 5 years as managing director of marketing comms, and now for the last year and a bit at Augusta. So experience across large organizations with established brands, challenger brands, which are less known, and smaller, more entrepreneurial pre-IPO organizations as well. And from that experience, I've had a great opportunity to learn from many other people in BD, comms and marketing. And I've taken those learnings and put together a couple of frameworks, which I was hoping to talk through today, which potentially could be useful if you're working remotely right now to engage with stakeholders, to plan and communicate what it is that you're doing. So the focus of the chat is content, a model I call the content tree. It's a fairly straightforward model with a horny metaphor, which I'll come to in a minute. Before I get into that particular model, I'd like to set the scene with a couple of frameworks which I think are useful for planning. And the first of these is the GSIT framework. It's not my own model, it's something that's been out there for many years. And this is really about ensuring alignment in everything that we're doing. The first element of this framework is goals, business goals, understanding what it is the business is trying to achieve. That's quite obvious. I would have thought most people on the call are sitting there saying, yeah, of course, that's paramount to any marketing comms or BD that we would do. In my experience, that isn't always, however, codified or clear. So seeking clarity on business goals before doing any planning or strategizing around marketing, I think is important. Sometimes it is difficult, especially in multi-stakeholder partnership environments. Nonetheless, that clarity, some form of articulation, strategy that you might wish to. The framework GSIT, goals is the first step. The second is strategies, not strategy singular, but plural. And the reason I say this is I think there can be multiple strategies that you might require in comms and marketing to reach the business goals that you're striving for. And you'll be glad to know I have another framework, which I'll come to in a second, which is all about identifying and planning those strategies. But from those strategies come the objectives and tactics that we as Marcoms people know very well. And I'm sure there are people on the phone who are very deep in certain areas of tactics, maybe with many years experience in one of them, and others who might be broad, covering many tactics. But in my experience, to plan those tactics effectively, to get good return on investment, and most importantly, especially right now when we're not proximate to our stakeholders, to get good feedback, to get good buy-in, you have to align with business goals. So in an effort to plan those strategies, this is the second framework I mentioned, the Favorability Journey, which I've written articles about, and there are other webcasts of me chatting about this if you're interested in more detail, but here it is at a high level. In my view, you need to look at clients as individuals if possible. If you don't have the time or resource to do it at an individual level, you can aggregate by business type, industry, geography, or whatever it is. But the important thing is to understand where they are in their relationship, their journey with your brand, your business, your practice, your product. And if you can't get that insight, if you don't know where they are, it's very difficult to pick appropriate strategies to move them along their favorability journey with you. And it's even harder to pick the right tactics to execute effectively. So the next slide is an attempt to articulate this journey, which I've written pages about in just 4 chevrons. The first one is recognition, the second one is reputation, the third is relationships, and the fourth is revenue. For me, recognition is the first phase on the journey that anyone goes on, whether you're in a bar looking to buy a drink or whether you're trying to buy professional services. If you don't know the brands, if you haven't heard of them, you can't possibly choose them. And likewise for us as marketing comms people, we need to understand if the client knows us, and if they don't, we need to invest to raise awareness of our name. The second stage on the journey is reputation. This is something that comms people spend a lot of time working on. It's about evidencing that we are high caliber, making sure people believe that we are good and suitable either for the products that we sell or for the services that we provide. And comms people will feel that they own this, and rightly so, but to me it's comms is one of a number of disciplines that can add value around reputation. The third stage on this journey is relationships. Getting in front of the right people, obviously more difficult or different today than it once was, but that's about building confidence in the individual advisor or demonstrating the specific product is right for you at this point. Reputation. I was up to the relationships phase, talking about the importance of building relationships with your target market. The fourth phase of this journey is revenue, making sure that you have the right proposition price at that particular point in time. The point of this journey is to say, understand where your clients are. If they already know you, if they have trusted relationships with your brand or your individuals, you don't necessarily need to choose strategies that are for the early part of this journey. You can focus more on the revenue side of things. In professional services, that would be presentations and pitches, as opposed to on the recognition side, things like advertising and search engine optimization. So this is really about saying, understand where your clients are today in their relationship with your brand or your firm, and use that to guide whatever you might do later. Some people use this as an audit tool. Some people use it as a planning tool. I think you can use it for all. And look, if you don't like the articulation, you can change it. But for me, the important thing is being clear on where the target clients are and using that to guide whatever it is you do. So that journey is all about selecting the strategies to meet your goals. Assuming that reinforces the need for content, I'm in a second going to talk about the content tree model, which is the focus of this chat. The great thing for me about content is it can be used in multiple ways. I mentioned earlier on that content tends to be focused on reputation, but actually, my experience, content can be used across all stages of this journey, all the way from recognition through to revenue. To give you one quick example of that, a few years ago, I was Ernst & Young, managing marketing for one of their business units. We had some pretty decent budgets to invest, so we were able to build content-led programs, integrated Marcoms programs across all 4 stages of this journey. We produced adverts based on the content. We put a lot of time into raising our profile on search engines using that content. On the reputation side, a lot of media activity to make sure we're out there, lots of presentations and client seminars. On the relationship side, we had customized PowerPoint presentations for individual client groups that our partners took out, using that content to cement relationships. And finally, on the revenue side, we built a fairly innovative interactive web tool that would allow a partner to sit in front of a client and live benchmark the client against their peer group using the content from the work we've done. So one piece of content cut in different ways, used in different channels, could take clients all the way from the point where they didn't have recognition of the brand through to the point at which a revenue discussion was happening. So that's an example about where you can use content across this journey. So now the I guess the main event of this presentation, the content tree framework. Now, unfortunately, the technology is now working, so you're going to see my horrible clip art. I wish that the tech had failed now, so you couldn't see this, but that's not how it's worked out. Forgive me, I downloaded this about 10 years ago, and it was about the best thing that I could find, and haven't bothered to update it since. But this content tree model is a 5-step approach to using thought leadership. And it's really focused on service industries where you have internal stakeholders to work with. I've written a couple of articles on it, which are on the internet if you want to find them. So what are the 5 stages of this tree? And you'll have to indulge the metaphor. Starting at the bottom of the screen, if you can now see it, the first stage of the model are the seeds. The starting point of any tree of seeds, and the starting point for me are in content development is identifying the client issues that matter. I'll go into more detail in a minute. Once you've put some time into developing those client issues, you can create some shoots, which for me is a hypothesis, which articulates what it is you're trying to do and why it matters. And that's important for getting stakeholder buy-in. I'll come to that in more detail in a moment. The third step are the roots. Obviously, a tree needs strong roots to give it foundations, if you'll bear with the analogy. For me, in thought leadership, in content development, that's evidence, that's data, and I'll talk about what that looks like in a minute. The fourth element, a strong and sturdy trunk for your tree. In professional services, that's often a white paper. It could be different articulations of content depending on your industry and your customers' preferences. But for me, something solid is important. And finally, the branches, the top of the tree, the roots to distribute to market, which for me come at the end of this development process, but should be thought of at the beginning. So hopefully I haven't lost you. What I'm going to try and do now is bring this slightly unusual set of graphics to life a bit. So starting with the seeds, excuse me. The seeds are about what is keeping your clients awake at night. What are the challenges they're facing? And if you've gone through that favorability journey approach I described earlier on, you should know where your clients are with you. So you can use that information to guide the kind of issues that you feel they may be vexed by. In a partnership-led environment, the partner should know. If you're in different environments, you might need market research or customer interviews to inform that. But making sure whatever you have at the beginning of your process resonates with clients is obviously important. But it doesn't stop there. The next key element for me is differentiation. Because you can have the most timely, relevant idea, but if the entire market is talking about the same thing, you're going to be struggling to cut through the noise. And I've talked a couple of times in presentations recently about cutting through the noise. Having clear blue water between your ideas and others is important to help with that. Research is fundamentally important to that. Looking at industry magazines, LinkedIn, for example, what are your competitors putting out in the market on this topic? That should be checked. And the final point on the seeds element of this journey is the branches. I mentioned this earlier on. The branches are the last element of the tree, but you should think of them at the beginning. You can create the best thought leadership in the world, but if you haven't thought about how to get it out to market, you'll be delayed in affecting your work. So think branches when you're planting your seeds, if you'll allow me to continue with the analogy. So that's the first step of the tree, the seeds. But once you've planted the seeds, you want to cultivate them into shoots. And for me, that's some form of summary of what it is you're trying to do, a hypothesis. I've asked my teams in the past to do this in a structured fashion, articulating the situation clients are in, the complication of that situation, the problem they face, and then to identify what question we need to answer and then present our answer to that problem. It's the SCQA framework, which you might be familiar with. It doesn't really matter what you use, but in my experience, having some form of structured articulation of the hypothesis is important when you're competing for cash, when you're competing for support for investment. And in some of the teams I've managed where there have been 40, 50 people, everyone wants money. How do I decide where the money goes? I need some succinct summary of the proposition, and this kind of approach can help with that. But one of the things you need to do with this hypothesis is to identify how you're going to test it. How are you going to evidence that it's right or otherwise? And that leads us to the third stage of this content tree, which is the roots. So again, you start with the seeds, i.e. what's keeping your clients awake at night. You then grow some shoots, which is a hypothesis, a summary, and then you have to make the roots grow. And what are the roots? The roots are an evidence, something to really anchor, to give a foundation to your concept. Depending on your market, your service or product, that could be various different sources. It could be financial data, it could be market research, it could be customer interviews, it could be war stories from client-facing partners. It has to be relevant to where you are. And ideally, in my experience, you want more than one vector. You don't just want one set of data, you want several to reinforce and evidence that what you're doing is correct. But really importantly, you have to have the right to use that data, but it also has to be timely. Sometimes timeliness trumps everything else. I'll give you two very brief competing examples. A few years ago, I was working at Deloitte. One of my peers in another service line put a lot of money into a piece of research. By the time it had gone through multiple layers of approval, it was dated, and it just wouldn't land with the media. Conversely, earlier this week, the government's Office of National Statistics put out some data on the legal industry. My team and I wrote that up in half an hour within the data being released. We got it out to market through our channels. It's already got 7 bits of coverage, and we're only a day and a half into the launch. So timeliness, relevance is key. So the roots is about evidence, and the roots then hopefully form into your trunk. And we all need a large, strong trunk of our tree, of course. For me, the trunk will vary again by your industry, but sticking with professional services, law firms, consulting firms, which is what I know, it's a white paper. It's a document, hopefully nicely designed with 1,500, 2,000 words of analysis of the issue, looking at the client problem, looking at the data, explaining our solution to the problem. Some people write this themselves, some people use external writers or content agencies. I mean, you should do whatever it is that you're comfortable with and is relevant to your organization. One technique I found useful at this stage is storyboarding. So rather than simply saying to a writer or a content agency, here's the idea, off you go, sit down with them, map out the points you're trying to make, the data that's relevant, can be done in PowerPoint or whatever else you're comfortable with, and use that storyline in the way that a film producer might to encourage the rest of your team, whether internally or externally, to produce something that aligns to what you're interested in. And importantly for me, once that's all done, you need some form of review. Again, it varies by organization about what the relevant review framework is. But in my current role, I'm the CMO, but I ask some of my team to look at my own work just to give me confidence that what I'm doing is right. So always seek another point of view. And if you don't have people, you can use online tools like Grammarly, which will give you at least some sense about the quality of the writing. So that's the trunk. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to move quickly on to the fifth element of the tree, which, if my technology work, is the branches. And as I mentioned earlier on, you've got to think of the branches at the beginning, even though they come last in this tree. The branches are the routes to market. They are the way to get your content out there. And if you think back to my favorability journey concept, the branches, the channels have to align to your client's needs and where they live, where they hang out. I'm sure there are many webinars out there spending hours looking at channels, but for me, I tend to look at them in 3 groups. Owned channels, things that you control, your website, social media, etc. Earned channels, media, very important. Backing from industry organizations or other intermediaries is really, really useful. And then purchase channels where you have the budget, some form of paid or sponsored content. One thing I've learned over the years is as comms and marketing people, we might intuitively know what we think is the best channel for a particular tool or what will yield the best return. And the more experience you get, the more times you've done this, the better insight you'll have into that. But one thing we should always bear in mind is, what do our stakeholders actually value? And from my experience in working in partnerships, that can be sometimes more important than simply pure ROI on a particular channel. So the summary from this is, think of the branches at the beginning and find channels that work for the market based on where your clients are on their journey, and importantly, channels that work for your stakeholders. Otherwise, everything can be in vain. You'll be glad to know that's the end of the tree. And I'll quickly summarize it before hopefully we move into some questions. The tree is about developing content and making sure it's aligned to your clients' needs. It's starting with the seeds, what keeps your clients awake at night. Then the shoots, the hypothesis, some kind of summary of what it is that you can test. Then the roots, some data or evidence to check it works. Fourthly, the trunk, the written or finalized document that brings it all to life. And finally, the branches, which hopefully work for your stakeholders and also work for your clients. That all should come within some kind of assessment of where your clients are on their journey with your firm. I call it the Favourability Journey. Where are they in their awareness, knowledge, relationships? And you can use content to affect improvement along this journey across most of the areas. And finally, all of those tactics have to fit with your goals, with the business goals that you're seeking to fulfill. Otherwise, you can have a wonderful content output that simply doesn't move the needle. And in my experience, if the business doesn't see value, budgets get cut. On that happy note, you'll be glad to hear I'm going to stop talking now. Do you want to cut me off at this point, or shall we do a Q&A?
I think a Q&A would be good.
That was really insightful. Thank you. Lots for us to take on board. Absolutely open up to anyone who has a question, please. Obviously, ping it in group chat or just jump in and please pose it to Leor or the group. I've got one that's come through, which I could start with, which is, Leor, how has your strategy changed over the course of the last 8 weeks, and how have you been impacted as a team?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, for me, the biggest change I've seen in really tactics more than strategy is around media relations. A while ago, I think most people that I work with saw the trade media as probably secondary in importance to the national media. Everyone wanted to get into the Times or the FT. I mean, today those titles are obviously fixated on the pandemic, and quite rightly. They are, covering the pandemic from every angle, and if whatever it is that you're putting out isn't directly related to the pandemic, they're not going to engage. I had one very good contact of mine at a large leading national newspaper basically say to me, if it doesn't have pandemic in the headline, don't send it to me. And that's quite informative. The trade media, on the other hand, whilst obviously very interested in the pandemic, they're far more interested, in my experience, in the impact of the pandemic on their target market, and they're a lot more receptive to the kind of content, the one that would typically produce. So I mean, the key change I've seen in the last few weeks, other than the obvious of us all using Zoom rather than meeting in person, is the trade media has become more receptive and more important to the market that I serve. Does that answer your question at all?
Absolutely. Thank you. I've had another question come through, which is more around the future of B2B events. And, I noticed that Salesforce cancelled their event this year, and they're turning over, as companies turn their events into virtual events. How is that likely to change for you and, moving forward? And what's your view on that?
It's a really good question. I mean, I've historically put a lot of time and effort into both owned channel events, things that we run ourselves, and purchased events where we sponsor. I think there'll be a fall off in the short term in the purchase stuff, the kind of big events that we all will have attended, big conferences run by industry organizations. I know that they're all looking at their business models and finding ways of doing things, but I think that 400-person gatherings that we once had are gone, replaced instead by this kind of thing: smaller, more targeted, more personal group discussions, whether run by an individual such as VMA doing this one, or run by a trade body. But for me, the change is around tailored and focused and smaller. And of course, there are some big, MOOCs or whatever they're called, thousands of people listening to a presentation. But I think the large scale stuff will be paused, and it'll all be a lot more tailored, a lot more focused, and perhaps a lot more relevant to target audiences, because the technology that we're using today is kind of cheap, and the barriers to doing that are less than they once were. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very insightful. The idea of going anywhere with 400,000 people at the moment scares the hell out of me.
Even 40.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, thank you, Leor. I'll just ask if anyone else on the line would like to share a question. Okay, here one's on the group chat. Leor, I don't know if you can see that. I'm interested. You got that?
Yes, I'm interested in thoughts on adapting the favorability journey to B2C from Kate. Thank you for that question, Kate. I think it applies equally in B2C as B2B. And I mean, the example I often give in talking about the favorability journey is, imagine you walk into a bar and you're unfamiliar with what's on the shelf. You look at the bottles on the shelf. If you don't recognize the brands, how do you choose? If you realize that some of the brands have awards, it gives you a sense of their reputation. If the bartender comes over, they can give you some advice based on the relationship you develop with them. And finally, when the bartender says one bottle is $50 and the other one is $5, you'll make a decision who to give your revenue to based on the price. So, I mean, I'd probably buy the $5 bottle, but each to their own. The point is, you know, that's the favorability journey: recognition, reputation, relationships, and revenue. And I think it works for consumer brands in a bar as much as it does for a consulting firm trying to sell multi-million-dollar assignments to a CFO somewhere. At least that's my view. Whether you agree, Kate, or not, I'm not sure.
Actually pretty close. I've worked across IBM B2B, but also in consumer telco. And for me, the favorability journey, I think, matches up with stuff like prompted brand awareness, unprompted brand awareness, brand consideration, and then actually buying the darn thing. But yeah, it's interesting to see it in actually a more structured B2B way. And I appreciated that. That was good. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can see a note from Shishir Baxi, but I'm not sure if that was a question or a typo. Oh, there you go. Okay, thank you. Leor, I'll leave it to you.
So thank you, Shishir. The question you're asking is, are influencers likely to wield influence anymore in both B2B or B2C constructs? Will they be used to mold empathetic brands? So you're asking about influencers and how influential they'll be. I mean, I've always been amused about the power of influencers in B2C. It's not my area of focus. I've always been shocked about how one celebrity can, you know, pick up a drink can as they're presenting and turn the brand round, and suddenly, you know, sales leap or whatever. And I've always assumed that B2B customers, and I'm going to say this very delicately because we're recording this, I've always assumed that B2B customers are more professional, more objective, and perhaps less emotional and therefore less swayed. But I have seen established figures, powerful academics, for example, get on stage and say something, and that really impacts the ability of a professional services firm to sell or otherwise. Reputation can be swayed by powerful individuals in B2B very easily. And I think today, when in-person contact has reduced and we're relying a lot more on perhaps what we see in the media and the press, powerful individuals saying positive or negative things about your brand, whether you're this or a consulting firm, even more important. So my answer, Shishir, is I think influencers are probably more relevant, for better or for worse, today than they were 8 weeks ago when we were all going out to network and meet and eat and drink.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leor. Just going to keep it open if anyone else has a question for Leor, or equally for any sort of, you know, people on the line who have any opinions or thoughts. Please feel free to jump in.
I can see a question, Jimmy, from Neil. Shall I take that?
Yeah, please do.
Thanks for your question, Neil. So you're asking, to continue the analogy of the content tree, how do you unearth the seeds that will flourish? And I think that's a really good question. I'd probably identify 3 points. So if I just recap on the model, the point of the seeds is the client issues, the things that matter to clients. So for me, the first test is, how do you know it matters to clients? And that's about some kind of testing. It could be based on looking at survey data if you're conducting client surveys. It could be asking your partners if you work in a law firm or consulting firm what they're hearing. So some evidence to sustain the hypothesis that that issue is relevant to your client base. The second one, and I touched on this in the presentation, is around differentiation. You can unearth the best seed, but it won't grow into a shoot if the market is incredibly noisy, is saturated with content from other people. So making sure whatever it is you seek to articulate is slightly different from what everyone else is talking about is important. And that can be difficult. You know, the herd mentality is that people follow what others are doing, but you're not going to get traction in the media if you're the fifth person to give them the same statistic. And the third thing that I think is incredibly important in trying to grow your seeds, and I touched on this again several times, is stakeholder buy-in. Every organization is different, you know, authorities, sign-offs, protocols differ by organization, whether you're federal or centralized or whatever. But if you don't have buy-in from stakeholders around whatever it is you're putting out to market, it's not going to get support, it's not going to get budget, and you're not going to thrive. So it'd be those 3 points for me. It's about making sure you've got evidence that the seed is relevant, that it's different to what everyone else is saying, even subtly, and thirdly, that stakeholders agree that this is the right thing to talk about. Does that answer your question at all, Neil? I'll take silence as a yes. Oh, thanks, great, thank you. Wonderful.
There was another question on there, Leor, actually, from Laura as well, just above.
Oh yes, thank you very much. So Laura's asking, do you think campaigns will start to have a quicker turnaround and shorter lifespan in order to stay relevant, to hit the right tone? Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So you're asking about the longevity of campaigns. I certainly think things are moving more quickly today than they were a few weeks ago, and a few weeks ago was moving more quickly than a few years ago. I mean, I recall when I first got into professional services marketing in 2004, we would put together a piece of thought leadership, a piece of content, and use it for 3 to 6 months. And because of the lack of availability of data, because of the infancy of the internet and, you know, the limited range of channels at that time and everything being print-centric, you would get bang for your buck for a sustained period. And as technology has moved forward, as people are more used to timely, just-in-time communication, the news cycles are shorter, people's attention spans are shorter. And today, because people have got a lot of time to look at things online, you know, they're looking for the latest buzz, the latest thing, the most recent up-to-date data. So I do think that longevity of campaigns has probably decreased, and the need to be fresh has grown. That doesn't mean to say you have to write off a piece of thought leadership after a few days and come to the next one. You can chunk your content. It's possibly an Americanism, but for me, that's about having a base of data, a base of evidence, and deploying them over a period of time. So you're not just saying the same thing time and time again, you're coming out with the latest iteration. That could be surveys that you've done, coming out with a different industry cut every week, or a different geography cut, or coming out with a new case study to evidence the survey every other week. So in that way, with a fresh take on it, you can have longevity of your work, even though today news cycles are shorter, attention spans are shorter. Hopefully that's an answer to your question, Laura. I see another question from Nick, if you don't mind me answering that, Lucy. How many channels do you provide content for, and in what percentage in the service industry? Is it following the trend of video increase? So how many channels do you provide content for? Horses for courses. Some of the campaigns, some of the initiatives I worked on over the years are focused entirely on one channel and one specific vendor or element of the channel. I mean, I've done certain things that are entirely centric on LinkedIn, which is obviously highly measurable and you can be highly targeted. I've worked on other integrated programs. I referenced some stuff that I'd done at EY, which was on a very large budget and was targeted at literally hundreds of channels in terms of media outlets all over the world, online, offline, paid, owned, etc. So I think you have to be tailored. I don't think there's a one size fits all. Ideally, you want to maximize the channels to market as long as they're relevant to your target market, as long as they work with the budget and the resources that you allow. But the point I'd come back to in conclusion is, and this is perhaps more relevant to B2B professional services, think about what your partners value. I mean, I recall doing a program when I was at FTI Consulting that reached a large number of media outlets, but some of my partners just weren't fussed about that because they didn't believe their core buyers read those. So when I looked at the ROI at a high level, 141 media hits on a piece of real estate research was wonderful, but the partners only really valued 5 or 6 of them. So conclusion, as many channels as you can subject to resource, but think about what stakeholders value and use that as the lens through which to analyse. Hope that's okay.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great, Leo. And if you know, there's actually a follow-up from Shishir, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, thank you. Shishir saying, frequently I find that clients don't really know what's bothering them. So I myself going to the shoots first, then the routes. Yeah. So you're asking, do clients know what they want?
Exactly,
or importantly,
yes.
what they need?
Yes.
And I think that's a very valid question. Sometimes they don't. And again, I spent 20 years in consulting. One of the reasons clients come to consulting is they often don't know and they're looking for the answers. So you're right. It may be that on the face of it, the client doesn't know what they want. But I do think you can get to the heart of their need with the right questioning, and whether that's surveys or face-to-face investigations, it does sometimes require someone who's knowledgeable, though, to do it. I mean, I'll give an example. We produced a piece of research at Augusta just 4 weeks ago, now looking at the financial stability of law firms. We were trying to understand the strength of their balance sheets, whether they had the flexibility to weather the current downturn. In order to make sure that was valid, we needed someone internally who is an economist by background to ask the right questions and to challenge the people we were talking to appropriately. I mean, I could have tried to have done it, but nowhere as effectively as someone who's got an economics background and had worked as a lecturer at university. So having someone with the right knowledge to provoke your audience into giving you the insight into what they need is important. You don't always have that in-house. You might have to buy it from a consultancy firm or use an academic, but you're right, it can be difficult. You just need someone with some insight to focus that perhaps more effectively than those of us who have a very broad but shallow knowledge of the subject matter will be able to deliver.
Excellent, thank you very much.
I see a question from Christina. Is the turnaround time of the campaign still not a function of the buying cycle of the product you are purchasing? I think that's a good question, and sometimes the answer is yes. If you're working on a very long-term buying cycle, perhaps for large value items, it's reasonable that whatever you're doing will take a long period of time. But if I come back to my earlier comments, technology has moved on, and oh, I'm sorry, Christina is apparently Jonathan. According to Christina, you are using your wife's account. So Jonathan, thank you for the question, but I'll stick with my answer. I think it's a function of technology having moved on and people's attentions having got shorter. I mean, I worked for several years in the Big Four looking at perhaps selling audit, which, as anyone knows, FTSE 100 audit, 10, 15, 20 million pounds, many, many months of discussions, pitch analysis, long buying cycle, big ticket item, high visibility, regulatory constraints. Building a campaign for that takes time, but attention moves on quickly. So if I come back to chunking, being able to come out with fresh insights in order to meet that audience on a regular basis, I think is important, even though the buying cycle might be many months rather than many hours. Thank you to Christina and or Jonathan for that question. Robin asking, are you increasingly looking at account-based marketing to campaign deployment? So for me, the construct of account-based marketing is about thinking of an individual target account and tailoring whatever you're doing to them appropriately. And I'm fully behind that. I think you have to be as granular as possible. And I think I mentioned this at the beginning of my Favorability Journey chat. The Favorability Journey concept is about looking at buyers as individuals where possible, thinking about where an individual buyer is and their relationship with your brand or with your people and helping to move them across. So if you have the time, if you have the resources, if you have the data, and obviously the support from stakeholders, I don't think it's account-based marketing. I think it's individual-based marketing that's most effective today. And with so many of our channels being tailored, I mean, I'll come back to LinkedIn, you can hit an audience of one on LinkedIn, you know, where they work, which company they're with, their role title, with the ability to be that focused. Where we can, I think we should be targeting people at the smallest number, the most granular level possible. Sometimes you have to aggregate because data's not available or because there are many buyers with similar traits. But I think account-based marketing is possibly, and I'm going to be controversial, possibly a bit passé. I'd say individual-based marketing is in today, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Leor. That was really insightful, and hopefully, you know, everyone has thoroughly enjoyed it. And as it's being recorded, you might have a new sponsor by the end of the week.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. But, yeah.
I have a question, final question, unless anyone else, by all means, wants to jump in. It's a bit broader, but as a business, what are Augustus's plans to reopen, and how are you bringing people back in, and what's your approach to tentatively, you know, getting back to normal?
I mean, that's a really good question. I'm just the CMO. I don't tend to you know, make all the decisions on an operational level. I leave that to our COO, who's very capable in the area. You know, if she was on this call, she'd probably say we're waiting to see. We don't know what the future holds. We're concerned about the safety of our people. We're working effectively online. You know, we're able to speak to any of our clients around the world on Zoom. We put a lot of time into Zoom. On email, we have virtual telephony. So we're as effective today as we once were. In fact, in some ways, we're saving less getting in a cab or hopping on the tube to meetings. It's all, you know, real-time virtual. So I think we as a business, in my personal view, I'm not speaking for the company, but in my personal view, we can be as effective virtually as we can sitting in our very nice offices in the centre of London. May differ for other organisations, but things are okay for us right now. So I think we're waiting to see what happens, thinking of the safety of our people and our clients. And, you know, technology, Zoom particularly, I don't have a logo of Zoom to hold up, but thank you to Zoom, is making life as easy as possible in these difficult times.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's consistently the message we're hearing from many businesses as well. Thank you. I'll just give everyone a final opportunity to jump in with any questions or comments ahead of us closing. But otherwise, Leor, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. And I think I speak on behalf of everyone. It's, you know, it's been really interesting and very insightful for us.
Well, thanks, Jimmy, for the invitation. Thanks, Lucy, for inviting me, and really appreciate all of you paying attention and not mocking my horrible clip art, which I do.
Yeah, really appreciate it. All right, take care. Thank you, everyone, as well.
Thank you, Leor.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us.